Welcome to the lesson series on the Dutch landscape. Um, it's a DLE course for the third graders, and it discusses the Dutch landscape in really some detail. I start this lesson series off with a very simple question, and the question is, what is this picture? It's a photograph, and it's a landscape, and I'm looking for a particular time and place. Now, this is a landscape that we see today in the world as well. We see it sometimes in the north of Canada or on Antarctica, and it is, in fact, a blizzard. It's a whiteout. During a blizzard, these super sharp winds and a lot of snowfall turns the landscape into a complete white, opaque thing, and you can't look through it and you can't see anything, and everything looks white. And that is what is called a whiteout. It occurs during blizzards, fierce storms in the north or in the extreme south of the world. And this is what the Dutch landscape looked like in the year 150 before present BP. So 152,000 years ago, roughly. And this was during the middle of the most important ice age. It's not the most important ice age, but it was definitely one of the coldest ones that we've had in the recent geological history. Recent geological history being, let's say, the last 2.5 million years. Why that is about 2.5 million years, we'll get to later during this lecture. Anyway, the idea was that I'd start off with sort of a joke, a sort of a tricky question, and then ask, what is a landscape? If we're thinking about landscapes, what are we talking about in a linguistical sense? Can you give a definition of what a landscape is? And during class, most of you came up with some very interesting ideas, and I gave you two definitions. One was by Mr. Vischer, who is a physical geographer, and he says, everything that you see on the surface of the earth is called a landscape. It's the total image of the on the surface observable phenomena. It's just a fancy way of saying everything you can see. And the European Union goes into this a little bit more in detail, and they say a region so as is observed by people, so again you have to be able to see it, and of which the character is determined by natural and or human factors and the interaction between the two. So there's a nature component to a landscape, and there's a social component, a cultural component, a human factor involved in shaping these landscapes. So if we go back and say, what is this? And we define this as a picture of the Dutch landscape in the year 150,000 before present, then really it's kind of a trick question, because according to these guys, Mr. Fischer and the European Union, that wasn't really a landscape because there were no phenomena to be observed except the whiteout. And a landscape consists of more than just a fierce thunderstorm. If there's nothing to observe, there's really not much of a landscape to see. We've been talking about landscapes before, even though we haven't really called it landscapes, but in the second grade and in the first grade, a lot of these things that we'll come across have been, talked about, especially climate and natural disasters in the first grade, and geology and the Terschelling course, the island course that we did in the second year. So we played a game, and most of you wrote down some things that, we played Boggle in a couple of minutes, and most of you wrote down these terms that have to do with landscapes. So some of you came across savannas, steppes maybe. Other people wrote down processes in shaping the landscape, such as soils, erosion, sedimentation, um, pioneer plants, all these things. And um, it was really just to sort of refresh your memories, because what I really want to go to is my vacation pictures. This is me in the middle of a landscape. This is in the Austrian Alps, if I'm not mistaken, and it's early in the year still, because it wasn't this year, because this year there is hardly any snow. But the year that I was there was still some snows, and we were pretty high up the mountain, and I'm standing in the middle of this field here, and it's just about the altitude of the tree line, and it seems as though I made quite the journey, traveling to get here, while in fact you can see a bit of the road here, and wasn't really that hard to get here. We went up higher to the Alm later, and I don't think I have any pictures in this PowerPoint of that occurrence, but this is just sort of everything that you see in this picture, except maybe me, is part of the landscape. And so there's mountains, and there's clearly some erosion going on, some weathering on over here, and then it rolls down, and you've got these, alluvial fans over here, and ridges, and there's some frost weathering going on here. And people have influence here too. This grass was clearly planted because it's different than the other types of green that you see. And there's a road over here. So the total image, this would be a mountainous region, right? This is a completely different landscape, and this is also a vacation picture. It's 1 year prior to this vacation. I was in Morocco, and this is what happens if you cross the Atlas mountain range. You come very, very, very close into the desert region. It's very arid region. There's hardly anything that grows here except maybe, some plants. And the reason why these rocks are red and brown and dark is because they're just basically caked by the sun and oxidated. There's some, minerals in the rocks, and they start to rust. Iron, magnesium, all that sort of metal stuff that starts to rust within the rock. And here you clearly see that there's an erosion pattern by a river. This is almost like the Grand Canyon. It's a very, very similar form, and it's in the Jebel Sarho in Morocco, not far from where, amongst other movies, but Star Wars was filmed, I believe, in Ouarzazate, just in the Moroccan desert. And here we see the landscape of my youth. This is near where my mother and father live, in the east of the Netherlands, and it's a completely different landscape. And I've asked you, what are the main differences between the mountains and the arid regions, and of course, this. And it's a lot greener. There's clearly a lot more rainfall, and there isn't any differences in altitude or relief, as it's called, and a lot more influence by people here. They've made a road, and they've put up a fence, and they kept the tree line intact, and then they cut the grass, etc. So we already saw sort of that, the character of landscapes. This is Norway. This is, again, another vacation that I take. I like to take walks during my vacation time because I'm a boring old guy and I like to walk. So here I am walking on the fjell in Norway. This is the tundra. And here you see that landscapes very clearly are either very, nature-like or very formed by humans. And here you see that there's a nice interaction with, the highway, the walking highway, because in Norway everything is really pretty neatly planned, and it looks really wild, but everything is cultivated. So this is a road, and it really is the human factors in the modern world that really shape landscapes more. And of course, there are natural processes going on, and it's kind of one of the interesting things why we study landscapes is to see how people cope and how people interact with our landscapes. So I've asked you, is there a little or a lot of human meddling in this landscape? And most of you said, well, there's very little human meddling, except maybe for the road. And I'd agree with you. And then this is the yard of my mother. I have a very tiny yard, and she has a very big yard. Her yard is big enough to put in another house, one of these garden houses, and she's a gardener, and she likes to make gardens look pretty with flowers and plants, and so this is her backyard, and of course this is a suburban landscape with big houses in there, and there's a terrace over here where you can sit in the shade while you drink your lemonade, and everything here is planted, and it's fertilized, even though it's the middle of summer, and it was a rough summer that year, I guess, because the grass is turning brown, and maybe we should have made a little more water, a little more rain, like artificial rain in the garden, spray it a little bit so these plants grow better. But obviously there's a lot more human meddling going on here than on the fjell, and here's a lot more human meddling going on, so a lot more interaction. And then I sort of said, okay, take these landscapes and you can split them up in mostly natural landscapes and cultural landscapes. And most of you remembered, some of you remembered, or maybe one person remembered, at least I remembered, that we've discussed this in the Terschelling course as well, where we said that the dunes and the Vod itself were natural landscapes, where the natural processes are 100% dominant, and there isn't a lot of visible meddling by humans. And cultural landscapes, the human processes are dominant, and it's the story of man taming the wild. Man being, the English word for people, and it includes women as well, as clearly shows. My father, the only thing he does is he cuts the hedge because it's, high and he's larger. But the rest of it is my mom. The hedge would be on this side, and it, makes sure that we don't see our neighbors too much. Now, then I asked you, did you understand what I just explained to you? And then everybody said, yeah, we understand. This is a natural landscape. And then this is clearly a natural landscape. There is hardly any human. This wasn't dug by some guy with a shovel. This was dug during the course of millions of years by a river. Erosion was the process. So clearly it's a natural landscape. And then this was a cultural landscape, because everything that you see here, everything, every little detail was planned, and human processes are formed and tamed by men and all have a specific function for people. And then this was the most extreme case of a cultural landscape planned by my mother. And then this is the fjell, and it was mostly a natural landscape. And one of the interesting titles of the chapters of our second grade book was called From Mountains to Oceans. And From Mountains to Oceans is an chapter and completely built around landscapes and processes that form them. And the title of it is From Mountains to Oceans, and my question to you was, what goes from mountains to oceans? And, the correct answer was water goes from mountains to oceans. It precipitates in the mountains via snow or via rains, and then it flows via groundwater and rivers, and it eventually ends up in the ocean, and it takes a lot of stuff with them. Here I am with one of my best friends, and we've just climbed a mountain, and we've, put a little rock in this frost-weathered zone, and we've put it on top of the debris pile over there to make an offering to the mountain gods. And we had a sip of whiskey, which is, what we do every time we reach the summit. And then here I am with another friend of mine on the beach, and this is the same year. Is it the same year? Yes, this is wintertime. This is summertime, even though, we're wearing hats, but we're in Norway. This is the same as the fjell. This was actually taken the same day, I think. Was it? Yes, it was the Storunden. All right, Storunden climb. So we followed this yellow brick road, and then we ended up on top of that mountain over there. Was it? Yes, I think it's probably somewhere over here. And we were in the zone of frost weathering, and it looks like that. And okay, so water flows from mountains to oceans. Clearly, it does. And what it does when it goes from mountains to oceans is it takes material that is weathered and came loose and transports it to the sea and transforms the rocks into finer grained material, either sands or clays, and that process is called erosion. And the transportation of sediment, and then it eventually, when the water reaches the ocean, it drops every little grain of sand and clay, and it drops it in the ocean. And so water is the great flattener of the earth. It flattens mountains and it builds up ocean, or at least sea level basins. And this is a very, very important concept, first realized by one of the great heroes of geology, and one of my great heroes, because he was a very clear thinker, and he's sort of as a person realized something that no one ever really realized before. And he said, he was a terrible writer, by the way. The book that he wrote was just horrible to read, but one sentence is pretty good. And he said, the heights of our lands are thus leveled with the shores. Our fertile plains are formed from the ruins of mountains. And this is a continuing theme where these mountain regions over here and over there, especially this one is very important to us, these are the Alps, they are leveled with the shores to build fertile plains. And our country is largely fertile plain made up of Alps. So the sand is not that fertile, but the clays on the soil where we live, that's very, very fertile. And this goes on as plate tectonics make new mountains and then water erodes them. This goes on and on and on for as long as the Earth has been around, which is roughly around 4.5 billion years. So this is him. This is the guy, Mr. James Hutton, and this is the rock in Scotland where he first realized, how the Earth moves, and that the Earth is a lot older than the 6,000 or so years that Bishop Ussher came up with. And he said there is no vestige of a beginning because, deep time, it's very far away. You can't, look to the year zero anymore because everything has been eroded and recycled and crushed, and then new mountains were formed. So there is no vestige of a beginning. We can't even conceive how long ago this is. And we can't look back in the diary of the Earth. And there is no prospect of an end either, because as long as there's plate tectonics, new mountains will arise, etc. So two beautiful sentences from that book that is, for the most part, pretty much unreadable. And then I've asked you, okay, if we're thinking about all these long-term processes that build landscapes, what are we talking about? What kind of geological time zones are we thinking in? And most of you remembered that we were in the Cenozoic era, and that's the period of the new life, and it started with the death of all the dinosaurs and the end of the Mesozoic era. So dinosaurs died, the story of the asteroid hitting the Earth, and then the nuclear winter, and it became very cold, and dinosaurs couldn't live anymore, and the era of the mammal was, beginning. And it's called the period of the new life. And mammals, rats and gerbils and horses and apes and eventually people was about to begin. And if we cut the Cenozoic era up, we see that there is a tertiary system, which is about, 62.5 million years of the 56 million years. And then there is the Quaternary system, that is about the last 2.5 million years. This is the period of the ice ages, and this is why I, in the first slide, said, the 2.5 million years is not some arbitrary line. It's the, boundary between the tertiary system and the quaternary system. And this was known by most of you because some of you actually remember something that I explained to you, I don't know, a year ago. So it was some hard thoughts, and I could see some people almost breaking their brains over this. But some of you remembered this. And what you didn't know, because I didn't explain it to you, or maybe you knew but you were afraid to say, is that you can divide up the Quaternary system into the Pleistocene era, which is for the most part of the Quaternary system. So we're going, this is this plus that, and then this and this is equals the Quaternary. All right, so the Holocene and the Pleistocene make up the Quaternary and the Tertiary make up the Cenozoic era. There we go. Holocene. This is where we live now, although scientists have decided that the Holocene has ended and we're now in the Anthropocene, but I'll leave that for another time. That's a complete lecture series by itself. So I'll just say that we're in the Holocene for now, and the Holocene, is where all history takes place. Everything that you learn in history class, that's Holocene, with the Stone Age and the Iron Age and the Bronze Age, and if any of you play, I don't know, Forge of Empires or whatever, you start off in the Stone Age and then you build your empire until eventually you end up in the 19th century Enlightenment period and the Industrial Revolution, and this is where we become very proficient as people. And I sort of said, okay, it's very important to realize that the Holocene is when Homo sapiens becomes pretty amazing. Here we were hunting mammoths and trying not to be eaten alive by saber-toothed tigers, and we were basically cavemen, and we made these beautiful little artworks in caves. Think about the Altamira caves, and we made these little statuettes of very fat women with the large breasts and the very pronunciated sort of fertility signs. And this is when we really become the rational, well, hardly call it rational, but this is when we sort of start to philosophize in a modern way, the way we do now. And this is when the school system was invented, and this is when you didn't have to work on the land anymore, except maybe during summer holidays. And so in it was only the last 12,000 years that we started inventing cool stuff like agriculture, cities, cotton, clothes, fridges, pizzas, movie nights, and computer games. Holocene, yay! That's the last, 12,000 years is a nice boundary to take. So Pleistocene, all, cold periods, warm periods, cold periods, warm periods, glacials and interglacials, as they are called, coming from the French word for ice, glace. Every time I'm in France, I voudrais a glace, s'il vous plaît, and then I get a piece of ice cream. So interglacial means between glacials, between cold periods, and also remember that the English words for the thick packets of ice that you see in mountains are called glaciers, which also comes from French. So glaciers and glacials are, glacials are period with large glaciers. It kind of makes sense if you think about it from a linguistic point of view. And the Holocene is just the latest interglacial. So Ice Age, interglacial, Ice Age 2, and then the Holocene. And I'm not going to bother you with the names of the glacials, although later during this course I probably will. So Sala Ice Age, and then Amian, and then the Weissel Ice Age, and then the Holocene. So later, we'll pick it up step by step. And we are over here, which is in the Holocene or Anthropocene, if you want to be completely correct. Okay, now if you know all the way back, if you know that water takes material from mountains and brings it to oceans, and you know that the Netherlands has been near the sea for a long period of time. A long period of time. Can you then explain the sentence, the Netherlands is like the drain in your shower? And none of you had a problem with that because everybody could see that water always flows to the lowest point. And the Netherlands has been a low point for a long time. The Netherlands has been sinking for the last 300 million years. The North Sea, in fact, has been sinking for a long time. And so a lot of rivers, like the Rhine and the Meuse, they go, the Meuse? I don't know, and the Ames, and they go in the direction of the Netherlands. So the Netherlands is like the drain in the shower, all the water, Skeld as well, is going this way. This area is where everything flows. And just like in the shower where there is soap and there is mud, and I don't know what you kids do, like sweat, and everything goes this way, and sometimes you have to clean this. Hairs, okay, this is kind of getting gross, but sometimes you have to clean it, and the Netherlands, exactly like that. Every gross little stuff that the Germans throw in their river eventually ends up in our country. So, oh, I drew arrows. Wow, beautiful. And so questions that we will be addressing in the next, I don't know, 8 or 10 or so lectures will be, what natural processes help to build the Dutch landscape? How long ago did these processes shape the Netherlands? Do or did all processes occur everywhere to the same degree? What human processes help to create the Dutch landscape? Where in the Netherlands are those natural processes still dominant? Are there places where those natural processes are still dominant, or is everything regulated by people? Where are the cultural landscapes dominant? How did the cultural landscapes evolve with new technology? Are there regional differences between various parts of the Netherlands, or are all landscapes the same? So all of these questions, will be addressed, and hopefully, you'll learn some stuff.